Sorry if you heard us speaking about the logistic. This is always the case when especially we are moving from the usual Zoom to Teams. But I'm confident that this is going to be a great event and especially a very timely one. My name is Dr. Giada Lagana, and I am Liverpool ECR Fellow and a lecturer in politics at Cardiff University, and also the president of the Irish Association for Contemporary European Studies, who is the co-host to this seminar series that we organize yearly jointly with our UK partner association, UACES. And the objective of this seminar series is to bring together scholars from across the UK and the island of Ireland, but also more broadly because our networks really spans all over Europe and beyond, to consider and reflect on common crises, shared challenges, and emerging opportunity for cooperation and collaboration. Today, to discuss the past and the forthcoming 5 years of Ursula von der Leyen European Commission, we are joined on this virtual stage by a stellar lineup. First, we will have Dr. Elena Baracani, who holds the Jean Monnet Chair on the European Union and as a global actor at the University of Bologna. She is an associate professor of political science and she is member of the academic board of the PhD program of political and social science in Bologna. She teaches the course The EU as a Global Actor, and she is responsible for the workshop EU Foreign Policy Analysis every year. Then we'll have Dr. Joelle Grogan, who leads the research team at the UK in a Changing Europe. She is also a senior research fellow at Central CEU Democracy Institute in Budapest, and she's a visitor senior research fellow at UCD Sutherland School of Law in Dublin. She's a legal academic with expertise in EU and UK law. Then we'll have Professor Kasim Hussain, who is Professor of European Public Policy and Administration at the University of Warwick and Senior Fellow under the ESRC UK in a Changing Europe initiative. His research looks at EU institutions, the backgrounds, careers and beliefs of EU civil servants, gender diversity and inclusion in the European administration, and the interactions between the European Union and the Member States and UK-EU relations pre- and post-Brexit. And last but absolutely not least, Dr. Jeffrey Rosamond, who works at Ghent University, where he researches climate change politics and policymaking in the European Union. Specifically, he explores climate policy negotiations within and between the Council of the European Union and the European Parliament. He is further interested in understanding political ideas and narratives that underpin climate governance in the context of the European Green Deal. Before I leave the stage to our amazing speakers, just a few house rules. So please check that your microphone is on mute, and if you could please use the Q&A function to input your questions. I will do my best to track everything. And after a short presentation from each of our amazing guests, we will have the floor open for questions and we will try to address all your queries or comments. Elena, il palco è tuo.
Thank you very much, Giada, for this presentation, and thank you, UACES and IACES, for organizing this seminar and giving us the opportunity to talk of the von der Leyen Commission. I'm sharing with you my presentation. Okay. It's this one. This is the end. Sorry, I go at the beginning. I hope you can see it well. Maybe this way is better. Okay.
I can see everything perfectly, Elena. Thank you.
Thank you, Giada, for the feedback. Okay, so you ask us to to focus on an aspect of the new Commission and then to elaborate on the consequences for a specific policy area. So this aspect of the new Commission on which I have focused my presentation is the creation of a new Commissioner for Defense and Space, because it has obviously implications on an important policy area that is defense. Sorry. So these are the main points I will try to briefly address. So the origins, first of all, of the first Commissioner for Defense and Space, then something on Andrius Kubilius and his vision, then the consequences of this institutional change, of this creation of a new role on defense, and then some concluding remarks. Okay, so the origins, first of all. I have distinguished here between the international context and EU context. I would say that this is the change that was triggered, obviously, by what was happening at the international level. So everything, I would say, that started with Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea. So we have to go back to 2014. Then Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, 2022, and increase in geopolitical tensions. At EU context, we see that it was, first of all, the Juncker Commission to put, I would say, for the first time, defense on the political agenda. And this led to the creation of, for example, of the European Defence Fund, but also to the adoption of the action plan to improve military mobility. Then this path was followed by the first von der Leyen Commission. In her political guidelines dating back to 2019, she talked of the European Defence Union. Then she created a new DG for defense industry and space, Davis. There was a strengthening of European Defense Fund. Then with the war in Ukraine, there was the creation of additional instruments. So EDIRPA to use the budget of the European Union to cover the cost of joint procurement of weapons by the member states. ASAP, again, used the budget of the European Union for the production of ammunition for Ukraine, then the European Defence Industrial Strategy and Programme. Then, second von der Leyen Commission. So in the political guidelines, we are in July 2024, she was writing this. She was mentioning the necessity to build a true European Defence Union, so what was not achieved during her first mandate, and she introduced her idea to appoint a commissioner for defense. Then there was also this report that she asked to do to the former Finnish president, Niinisto, on strengthening Europe's civil and military preparedness and readiness. Kubilius. You see here, I have summarized the main points on his biography, and I think it's very important to underline that before being Commissioner for Defense, he was a member of the European Parliament, and he played a very important role because he was the rapporteur on Russia. So as you can imagine, being the rapporteur of the European Parliament on Russia at the time of the Russian aggression against Ukraine is a leading role. And this is also important because it will probably help him, support him in establishing a good working relations between the Parliament and the Commission and the Parliament on defense. Then in terms of his vision, I have selected this short quote that I have taken from his answer to the European Parliament questionnaire as Commissioner designate. He's talking of challenges, one in the short term and one in the medium to long term. In the short term, he's mentioning this scenario of possible military aggression, and so the fact that the EU must be ready for this scenario. And then in the medium to long term, he's mentioning that the US is likely to diminish its presence in European defense. We know, especially at present, that this is no more a medium to long-term challenge, but another short-term challenge, I would say. Then, what are the consequences of this change on this policy that is defense? First of all, I would start from this, that defense has to do with the internal security, so the security of the European Union. So it's member states that are responsible for their armed forces and the security of their territory, but they have also granted on the security umbrella offered by NATO. So now we see that through the establishment of this European Defence Union, the idea is that EU supports the member states, how? Through investment, the industry, procurement, research and innovation. Based on this principle that Europe must spend more, better and European. There will be in the next few days, we expect this white paper on the future of European defense that will be drafted by Kubilius together with Kallas. They will identify the investment needs for the most extreme military contingencies. Then, as you can see, it involves creating a single market for defense, to work on joint defense projects, to work with the member states on joint defense projects like this European Air Shield and another project on cyber defense and much more. So I know that we had about 8 minutes, so I hope to be on time. So what are the concluding remarks? Number one, I would say that defense, as you know, is at present even more on the EU political agenda because of the new Trump presidency. We have heard the speeches, as the speech by J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference. Then this is a quote that I have taken from the speech by President von der Leyen, again at the Munich Security Council, 14th of February. So we need a surge in European defense spending. Currently, the EU27 are spending around 2% of the GDP on defense. Our defense spending went up, but we will need to increase that number considerably again. So we need a bold approach. And then this is the proposal by the President of the Commission, activation of the escape clause from the Stability Pact for defense investment, then a massive defense package to fund this, to support these defense projects of common European interest, and then the acceleration of the accession process of Ukraine. But my concluding remark is not only that defense is at present even more on geopolitical agenda. Another concluding remark is that the Commission is playing an important role in this policy domain. You know that we are talking of defense, so defense is considered as an intergovernmental policy area that is part of high politics. So you understand that the fact that the Commission is playing a role in all this through its functional competence on the market, on industry, on research, on investment, through its competence on the budget, means that supranational elements are entering in this intergovernmental policy domain. And last, if you want a concluding remark, is that it is clear that all this show that we are going toward more differentiated integration in this policy area of defense. And I think I can stop here. I hope it will be enough for this first part of the debate, and I hope to have respected the time ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elena. You were absolutely perfect and very insightful. Can I call on our virtual stage Dr. Joelle Grogan, please? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very impressed with the timing on that. I'm going to equally hope that I do such good timekeeping. I'm going to be talking about the rule of law and the rule of law crisis in the context of the new Commission, its policies, and also the continuation of what has been happening in terms of outstanding issues and how they can be tackled. Broadly, I'm going to talk about the new commissioner, Michael McGrath, who is Irish, just like me. You can absolutely run with the stereotype of what I look like. And then talk about some of the tools that he has available to him through the last commission and the challenges that we're seeing in the context of their use before looking forward and saying what issues are upcoming and what can we do about them. So first, just in the context of the rule of law, I know it's going to be so familiar as a concept to everyone listening. Very simply, though, the rule of law is the idea that no one, no man, no prime minister, no president, no king is above the law. Everyone is subject to the law. It's a fundamental value of the European Union and its member states. It's a critical, albeit very often invisible value. The ordinary citizen will struggle to understand or define the limits of the rule of law, but it's something that we only appreciate when it's gone. The rule of law crisis, as it's been called, has been emerging over the last decade, the last 15 years, paradigmatically in Hungary and Poland. It represents the systematic dismantling of checks and balances on government, the centralization of power within government, and the political control or dismantling or undermining of any independent institutions of accountability, including the courts, public prosecution services, the media, and civil society. Ultimately, in this context, elections may be free, but they're not fair, and they're questionably no longer free in some contexts. But we have a new Justice Commissioner, Michael McGrath. He's the Commissioner on Democracy, Justice, the Rule of Law, and Consumer Protection. This is a slightly adjusted portfolio from previous iterations of Rule of Law and Fundamental Values that Vera Jourova previously held under the last Commission. He is charged with leading work on rule of law and anti-corruption. Again, unsurprising to everyone listening, when you dismantle checks and balances, when you put forward quite an authoritarian or autocratic mode of governance, corruption is rife. They go hand in hand with one another. No rule of law, lots of corruption. The next thing he's charged with is consolidating the rule of law reports and to include a new dimension, the single market dimension, acknowledging again the economic inefficiencies of corruption. He will also be leading the new initiative, the Democracy Shield, which is aimed at targeting disinformation and foreign interference, particularly in the context of European elections. He's also going to be charged with ensuring the delivery, implementation, or the functioning of the new European Media Freedom Act and countering SLAPs. That's where government interference on journalism and, again, trying to undermine independent journalism. Let's talk a little bit about the tools that have become available. A lot of these tools are initiatives of VDL 1.0, and they're part of what's called the Rule of Law Toolbox. We have first, and I've already mentioned this, the Rule of Law report that is published every year. It reports on the state of the rule of law in all EU member states. The Parliament has called out the fact that the EU institutions themselves are not analysed as part of this report as one of its criticisms or points of feedback. But generally, we can say that the Rule of Law report is a good effort at analysing or a good effort at identifying issues within member states. In fact, the Commission highly lauds itself. It's been giving recommendations for the last 2 or 3 years. And in 2024, the report, it says 68% of recommendations have been followed in the rule of law context. Unfortunately, once we start digging behind those figures, we can say that the rule of law violators don't pay attention to any recommendations. Hungary continues to ignore recommendations put to it. But we can also say that there is, again, and this is something I'll talk about a lot in the context of rule of law and the challenges for the new Commission, which is the politicization of decisions in that context. We can also say that even where recommendations are given, those violators will keep violating. So if we think about the context of the 2024 report, a week before it was published, it was actually reputed to have been delayed in its publication because the Commission President von der Leyen didn't want to offend Italian Prime Minister Meloni and the reputed issues with regards to the lack of independence of the media, including the criticism that played out to be true that Meloni has been accused of using a lot of anti-defamation or using defamation suits against journalists, again, undermining independence within a country. Similarly, a recommendation to the Slovakian government to ensure the freedom of the press, ensure media freedom, has been largely ignored, especially in the context of the Slovakian public broadcaster, RTVS, which was disbanded and replaced, having been previously accused by Slovak Prime Minister Fico of being, quote, in conflict with the Slovak government. We also have, so essentially in the context of the rule of law report, we have a lot of recommendations, and states that will commit to the rule of law will continue to commit to the recommendations, but those that we really need to worry about will largely ignore them. And in the context of the report, at least it's not tied with any infringement mechanisms. Other things we have similarly are preventive at most. The Justice Scoreboard, the funding for civil society and independent media. These are preventive mechanisms. They're possibilities to improve rule of law, but when there's really an issue in the domestic context, it's very, very difficult to tackle. Of course, there are responses that the Commission can make. Classically, the Article 7 and the Treaty of the European Union. This is the I think it was called the nuclear option, but no progress has been made on that in any way, shape, or form. It was opened, the first stage of it was opened against Hungary and Poland. Hungary hasn't proceeded because it requires a great deal of commitment from all the other EU member states, which innately becomes very political, and we'll talk about wider geopolitical context and why that makes it so difficult. But what's interesting is the von der Leyen Commission closed it in the context of Poland with the election of the new Prime Minister under Tusk, who campaigns on a rule of law platform and a commitment to the rule of law. Now, unfortunately, within the context of the closure of the Article 7 mechanism in Poland, no actual reforms have proceeded for the reason that the current president of Poland, Duda, has blocked any reforms. And any reforms that are proposed by the Tusk government are immediately sent over to the Constitutional Court, which, again, as a consequence of rule of law failures over the last decade, are currently captured. So there's an ongoing rule of law crisis internally as to how you can solve rule of law issues within Poland without breaking down rule of law or without violating the rule of law, kind of grim irony. In terms of infringement mechanisms, the number of infringement proceedings and other enforcement tools at the hand of the Commission plummeted since the early 2000s. Again, this is recognition of both the complex political situation, but not really a commitment to seeing through infringement mechanisms as a means of ensuring rule of law compliance. In terms of probably what could have been considered the most successful effort in the last Commission that we could see in the next Commission, it's the conditionality mechanism. So tying committing to the rule of law and protecting the rule of law with money from the EU. There was a huge push, especially in the Hungarian context, locking up billions and billions of euro in funding. But again, geopolitics, wider international geopolitics plays a role. In December 2023, the last Commission, I should say, unlocked £10 billion of funding aid to Hungary, frozen over rule of law concerns in an effort to prevent the Hungarian veto on Ukraine. This will be one of the big questions for the next MFF coming up in 2028. How can we keep using what could be effective mechanisms when larger political questions are always at play? So in terms of outstanding problems, we still have critical issues in Hungary. In 2022, the European Parliament said it is no longer a democracy. It's essentially an elected autocracy. But we also have rising issues in Italy and Slovakia, but also outstanding issues in other member states. I always like to pause here and say that very often it's important to understand that it can be a slow burn issue, but there's no remedies are slow and solutions are slow, and very often it's almost a fait accompli. So giving the example of Bulgaria and the expected judicial reforms, they've been stalled for about 6 years, and there's actually no longer much political will. The Bulgarian government has almost said, we will accept that we will not get EU money in this context because it is too difficult to make these reforms against much larger economic issues being faced by the country. Aware that I'm not succeeding in as good a timekeeping as the last speaker, I am going to try and race myself to conclusion and say, let's look forwards. I've already highlighted some of the politicization or the political challenges of rule of law decisions that no matter how much we can explain the law and the legal decision making behind, say, infringement or conditionality mechanisms, they're innately political and will be politicized. How can you tackle that? Second, we have these issues of the lack of political will, making true reforms at base level very difficult. The reason that judicial reforms in Poland of the last decade were so successful, for lack of a better way of saying it, is because it reflected real, ordinary concerns with the slow pace of the judiciary. Countries coming in, governments coming in and saying, we will fix all your problems. You just need to get rid of institutions, can be ineffective rhetoric if there's such innate problems slowing down ordinary life and the perception of a functioning system. What can we do? Focus on rule of law awareness. Having ordinary citizens, ordinary voters understand the importance of rule of law is very, very important in and of itself. Again, I talk about it as an invisible value. We only see it when it's gone, which is not what invisible means, but thank you for staying with me. Second, make more accessible rule of law reporting. I avidly look forward to reading the reports, but I think I'm one of the nerds in the minority. Make them more accessible to ordinary citizens, to civil society and civil society organizations. We also need to think about the Democracy Shield initiative. It doesn't really have rule of law within it right now, but it relates. You cannot have democracy without rule of law. You cannot have anti-corruption mechanisms without rule of law. You protect media by protecting rule of law and vice versa. Second, and this is playing to the wider geopolitical context of the US administration being more aligned with those authoritarian and autocratizing states, we need to recognize the security context, that the security of Europe and the security of rule of law are innately intertwined. You need to protect institutions. You protect institutions with rule of law. On that dramatic note, I hand back to the speaker, or chair.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joël. And I'm calling on the stage Professor Hussein Kassim.
Hi there. Hi, everyone. Hope that you can hear me. I'm just about to share my screen, but you'll have to tell me if you can see it. Can you see anything from me as yet?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. How about now?
Not yet.
Okay. Maybe I'll just forget that. Okay, so thanks very much for the invitation. Having heard from two interesting speakers about sectors, I'm going to talk about institutions and organisation, and specifically about von der Leyen's leadership of the Commission, what we saw in the first term, and what we can expect from her second. A bit of contextualisation is helpful here. Von der Leyen's presidencies can be seen in the context of a formal presidentialization of the Commission, which really began in the late in the late 1990s. It was extended and dramatically developed under José Manuel Barroso, however. Prior to that, the Commission was a relatively weak office, and Commission presidents, with two very notable exceptions, so I'm not going to name because I'm sure that you know them anyway, had been weak. Why is that? Why do I make that claim about the Commission presidency? Well, first, it had no say over appointments or portfolio allocation. That was firmly in the hands of the member states, individually and collectively, and all Commission decisions about policy priorities, about the weekly meeting agenda, about the organisation of college and administration, they were all collegial. And as Jacques Delors once lamented in his and states in his memoirs, I had exactly the same vote as everybody else, namely one in college, and so there was always a threat everywhere at each time of being outvoted. The story, however, isn't just one of presidentialization. It's also a story of different presidential models. And that has a number of different parts. Structure and organization of the college is one part. The interaction between the president's cabinet and the rest of the organization is another. How that's managed, who does it, how present and how accessible the commission president is to other colleagues. I can remember speaking to commissioners at the end of terms saying the only time I ever saw the commission president was in the college meeting at the college. So this is a way in which this is an important aspect of presidential style. The third part is the president's working methods or the way of working. And here what I'm thinking about are the responsibilities that a president takes on himself or herself, the president's relationship with the SecGen and with the wider administration, but also how the college meetings are run. That element of style is also very significant. We should add to this that there's an institutional dimension, that relations with the European Council, particularly its president, but also with the European Parliament are key. And those are managed quite differently by different presidents. So that's a bit of contextualization. So what should we say about von der Leyen 1 and what follows about von der Leyen 2? The first thing to say is that von der Leyen is firmly in the Juncker mode, so very much closer to Juncker than to Barroso. What does this mean? Essentially two things. The first is that her style is very, very personal, personal in a programmatic sense, in the sense that her policy priorities are presented in the form of the political guidelines to the European Parliament. They become the Commission's policy priorities. They're translated into the Commission work programme. So it's very much the Commission president now who defines the programme of the Commission. It was not always like that. It wasn't like that before 2004. The other way in which von der Leyen's presidency has been personalised is in an organisational sense. How the college in particular is organised, and you may remember from the in the first round that she slightly tweaked the Juncker Commission. There were no longer 7 vice presidents and the rest effectively. There was now 3 executive vice presidents, several vice presidents, and the rest. So there was, the introduction of a 3-tier, or if you include the president herself, a 4-tiered system. Okay, it's interesting to note there's something sort of paradoxical about this, because von der Leyen wasn't a Spitzenkandidaten president, and it was the appeal to that particular mandate that Juncker made many times, not least in transferring his priorities into those of the Commission, but also in making or calling for particular appointments. Etc. The other element that's paradoxical about her strong her adoption of the Juncker mode is that she was only approved by 9 votes in 2019. However, the demonstration of the strength of her as her presidency and her came with the outbreak first of the COVID pandemic, and then later with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That's where those crises enabled her to demonstrate her credentials as a crisis leader. She quickly took up the initiative. She quickly responded to the challenge. In the case of COVID, for example, she called the pandemic a crisis. She came up with a series of solutions in its various phases, dealing with not just the sort of public health crisis itself, but also its social and economic consequences in both the short and the medium term. And she effectively set the EU's agenda on these issues. In the case of Russia, she presented herself as the voice of the EU. And it's really important here to remember that when Russia annexed the Crimea in 2014, it was Sarkozy who represented the EU, really, who presented himself as the EU's external face. It was not the Commission president. The other asset that she had that really strengthened her sort of credentials with respect to Russia's invasion of Ukraine was her NATO experience and her relationship with Washington. These in short, her performance as a crisis leader enabled her to consolidate her personal authority. Okay, so that's a sort of story of how she came to be such a strong and sort of personalized presidential leader, in contrast to her predecessor, particular Barroso. But she also has a particular personal style that it's really important to appreciate. She's very extensively interventionist, which differentiates her from both Barroso and Juncker. So everything has to pass by the 13th floor of the Berlaymont. Decision making is sort of famously made by the president, her chef de cabinet, and also the involvement of her press person. She's the public face of the institution. So even when the heavy lifting may have been done elsewhere within the organisation by another commissioner, she is the person who announces and effectively presents herself as the face of the organisation. That, of course, causes friction and resentment. It also opens her up to the criticism that she doesn't really make the most of the experience of the House, of the technical expertise of the Commission, and she also makes mistakes. Three of those I think we will all remember. One is triggering Article 11 of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Another is the sort of Sofagate incident with the Turkish president. That was spun very effectively by the Commission president. But one important sort of perspective on that is that it was more the result of a sort of failure to consult protocol services within the Commission that may have been the sort of cause of that particular problem. Though that's not saying that the president of the European Council didn't behave in an honourable way. And also, you might remember how very early on, after the outbreak of the recent crisis in Gaza, that she aligned the EU with Israel and was publicly criticised by leading EU figures. So there is this sort of presidential style, but also it carries dangers. With von der Leyen too, the composition and structure of the college is very much designed to maximise the president's authority. The composition, we're back to 15 EPP commissioners, only 4 from the centre left. There's an absence of very strong figures, so no Breton, no Vestager, no Timmermans, and the structure is very much designed to not only to deliver von der Leyen's key priorities, so they come under the sort of umbrellas of a strong and united Europe and the simplification of rules, but also to enable the Commission President to intervene and to take charge. So there's now 3 tiers rather than 4. There are now 6 executive vice presidents, including the High Representative, in charge of 14 project groups. They're all charged this time around with very specific objectives. The portfolios, if you look closely at the organogram, the sort of commission poster that I was trying to show you, but failed in sharing my screen. These are all designed to enable the Commission President to survey, to monitor, to keep commissioners engaged, but also to be able to intervene, to step in when she needs to. What are the questions? What are the sort of challenges here? Well, some are internal. There are to sort of draw on a comment that Jan Domenico Meoni made once in a different kind of context. So the perils of presidentialism. Personality politics are problematic because they can go well, but they can also go sort of very badly wrong if we rely on the judgment of a single person. There's also the Commission has come to sort of resemble, you might argue, more a sort of kind of court politics. And there's also the impact on morale that that having a strongly centralised, personalised leadership confronts the rest of the organisation with, and I'm talking all the way down from the college, through the administration. There are also external issues. You might remember, for example, that for von der Leyen 1, there was a real concern to gender balance the Commission and that at the college, and that was really largely achieved. But the second time around, that's been much more difficult, and von der Leyen has not succeeded. Most of the commissioners are men. And many of the member states to which she made an appeal to balance the ticket, to propose women, fell on deaf ears, and that shows something about her power positioning, I think, with respect to national capitals. The other point that's really important to make is that, and this is where I'll finish, is that much of von der Leyen's success, particularly when the EU was in crisis mode, which is sort of virtually all four of the 5 years, was through the president's impact in the European Council. She's been very effective at presenting practical solutions, at generating sort of creative and collective responses to sort of particular issues, but that was all permitted because her counterpart across the Rue de la Loire was somebody who wasn't so proactive, whose judgment often that was demonstrated not to be so sound, who often didn't do the sort of groundwork. But it's unclear that his successor, Antonio Costa, will allow the same kind of space, will be a different kind of president of the European Council to his predecessor. So that's also something to watch. And a recent trip to Brussels tells me that that's going to be promises to be a much more constructive relationship, but one where there's a clear sort of division of responsibility in a way that there wasn't for much of the last 5 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kasim, and sorry for the logistics with the screen sharing. Now, last but definitely not least, Dr. Jeffrey Rosamond.
Perfect. Thanks so much. So as Giada said in her very kind introduction, I study climate change politics. So I am a European Green Deal guy. And as most of you probably know, the European Green Deal was one of the Commission's priorities during the von der Leyen 1 Commission. Perhaps you could even argue that it was the flagship priority of her first commission. But perhaps you've noticed that in the last few weeks, the European Green Deal has really faded into the background of things, and we're really not hearing about it so much anymore. So what I want to talk about in this presentation is some of the achievements that we had in von der Leyen 1, as this political priority was really guarded through the multiple crises, through those turbulent times that we all lived through the last 5 years, and why, unfortunately, all signs point to the fact that there's going to be less progress made on the Green Deal in the upcoming commission. All right, so let's talk a little bit. I should say I'm coming again from a climate policy perspective, right? So what I'm going to talk about in the next section is going to be a little bit optimistic, because a lot of Commission, Parliament, and Council attachés all sort of agree that in the realm of climate change, there was some progress made during the von der Leyen 1 Commission. If you talk to colleagues who work in environmental politics or who work in anti-pollution politics, they're a little bit less optimistic than I'm going to be. But let's talk about what was achieved in climate policy during von der Leyen 1. So, as most of you know, we passed the European climate law, right? So we now have this goal of climate neutrality by 2050 legally binding. So it's written into law, and the 2030 target has been upgraded. So it was originally a 40% reduction of emissions from 1990 levels. Now it is a 55% reduction in emissions from 1990 levels by 2050. So that's great. We also had the passage of the Fit for 55 package, which is, quite simply put, the most comprehensive climate and energy package that the Commission has passed to date. So we had revisions and extensions of some classic pieces of climate policy legislation. So you all know the emissions trading system, the backbone of EU emissions reductions, that has been revised, as well as revisions of the effort sharing regulation and the land use change and forestry regulation as well. We also had the development of some new pieces of climate policy architecture that we saw in the last commission, such as the carbon border adjustment mechanism, right? So putting a levy on carbon imports on certain sectors as they're imported into the EU. We also have this social climate fund to help cushion the blow of the economic burdens of climate change on certain member states and certain sectors. And what's really important to note as well is that we also have some new ideas that have emerged, some new politics of climate change that have been added to our arsenal here. So this idea of the just transition is one that was particularly salient, and I'm sure that you've all heard of before, right? This leave no one behind. And although it is a contested term and perhaps not as universally applicable as the Commission would like to think it is, it does show that the Commission is now thinking at least about the social dimensions of climate change and making efforts to ensure that all sectors can come on board on this transition. So thinking about the social implications as we decarbonize our economy. So there's lots to be excited about in the realm of climate change that happened in von der Leyen 1. And so I'm a qualitative social scientist. Probably my favorite part of my research job is going in and talking to Commission officials, talking to the members of the European Parliament, and talking to the attachés who sit in the Council, and especially amongst the political center, so EPP, S&D, Renew, etc. There's a lot of happiness. There's a lot of, we did it in the von der Leyen 1 Commission of what was achieved in terms of climate change. There's sort of, it's been described as a unifying moment for Europe. However, there is a serious risk that we're not going to see quite the same developments in the von der Leyen 2. Now let's think about the political context that we had at the beginning of the von der Leyen 1 Commission, right? So there was the green wave in the European Parliament. The Greens increased their seat count. Therefore, the Commission sort of got a signal from the EU electorate that they were okay to take leadership and to make a move on climate policy development, sort of having this signal from the EU electorate with the green wave. We also had the Fridays for Future protests way back in 2019, right? So these ideas, these protest movements were filtering up to our political leadership and to executives in the private sector as well. Speaking of the private sector, basically political actors across the spectrum acknowledge that at the time back in 2019, there was a strong sign from the private sector to make a move on climate ambition, that it was time to get going, to make a regulatory framework, and that economic growth could be achieved by making big moves in green tech, by making big moves in this net zero industries that, you know, there's no future in a fossil fuel economy. So there was really this sense of, okay, we need to get going. We just need a regulatory framework. So at the time, the Commission had signs from the electorate and from the private sector to get going. So that's a very powerful message that they were dealing with. At the same time, there were natural disasters basically ripping through all of the EU's member states, right? So we had forest fires in Southern Europe. We had flooding in Western Europe. We had even tornadoes in Central Europe, I've been told, that were really wreaking havoc. So the leadership in the EU's member states were also becoming increasingly on board with the need to take radical climate action. So really, the Commission at the time, as the EU's executive, was empowered to make these big moves. Now, if we take a look at the political context entering this Commission, where we're at right now, first of all, let's look at elections. Elections matter, right? The Commission is the EU's executive body. It has its mandate to act from the European Parliament and from the elected governments of the member states. Well, we all know, unfortunately, for climate policy, the elections in the European Parliament didn't really go our way. So the Greens lost seats this time, and the right and far right parties increased their seat count. As well, of course, we have a less green council this time around. All across the EU's member states, there are far right and right-wing advances. Therefore, the Commission is getting less signals from both the Parliament and the elected member state governments to make these moves, to make moves like they did during the von der Leyen 1 Commission. So politically speaking, we're already not having the same green cheerleading base in our Parliament and in our Council as we did during von der Leyen 1. As well, and as we've talked about earlier in this panel, we have to think about geopolitics, right? We have a different geopolitical reality right now. So there's an extreme pivot to defense. Leaders are saying, listen, we have to make a move on defense spending. Donald Trump is acting belligerently. If we don't take security back into our own hands, we're going to be in trouble, and peacetime is no longer guaranteed. So this is sort of a competing political priority with climate change and can really risk taking the focus off of green objectives. Of course, we can't let this happen. We sort of have to learn to multitask to ensure that we're able to continue to decarbonize and protect our environment at the same time, while also investing in defense. As well, of course, as you know, this commission is all about competitiveness, right? So the Draghi report came out saying Europe's economy is stagnating. We're no longer, we're at risk of not growing to the level that we need in order to sustain our quality of life. So we have the von der Leyen II Commission already coming out of the gate saying, okay, we need deregulation, we need simplification, we need to attract investment, things like that. And deregulation and simplification is okay, especially when you think of climate policy and net zero technological development, because we do need to spur continued research, continued development in those fields. But deregulation and simplification is always a little bit risky when you're talking about conservation of nature or elimination of pollution or protection of biodiversity. So we might see a little bit of turbulence as the Commission attempts to deregulate. Okay, so how has this all played out so far in von der Leyen II? First of all, the European Green Deal is no longer explicitly laid out as a Commission priority, right? So in the first Commission, we had it very explicitly as one of von der Leyen's priorities. Now we sort of have this new plan for Europe's sustainable prosperity and competitiveness, of which this Clean Industrial Deal is a part of, right? Many of you know the Clean Industrial Deal should be coming our way next week, so we'll have to take a look to see what they officially roll out with that. And then we have sustaining our quality of life, food security, water, and nature. So she sort of separated the climate and the environment wings into different pillars. So already we're not having the European Green Deal take center stage. The discourse, the narrative is changing. So we'll have to see how that all develops. As well, we no longer have the executive vice president for the European Green Deal, right? So we no longer have Frans Timmermans, who was such a magical architect for the whole plan, and really getting a lot of credit for safeguarding the plan through all of the crises that the von der Leyen I Commission went through last term. Rather, instead, we have an executive vice president for a clean, just, and competitive transition. So really bringing in this language of competitiveness and economic growth into the transition, right, Teresa Rivera. And even the climate commissioner, so Wopke Hoekstra gets the title Commissioner for Climate, Net Zero, and Clean Growth. So again, really bringing in this discourse of competitiveness and economic growth even into the climate portfolio. And then finally, Jessica Roswell, Commissioner for Environment, Water Resilience, and Competitive Circular Economy. Again, we can't seem to escape the competitiveness narrative. It's really getting forced into all connections with both climate and environmental policy. All right, so to conclude, I'm definitely not a fortune teller, of course, but there are certainly risks that this triple planetary crisis, the goals of achieving net zero emissions by 2050, of protecting biodiversity, and of eliminating pollution may be sidelined during this commission for other priorities, for things like defense and ensuring the competitiveness of European industry, perhaps at the expense of environmental protection. Of course, part of it is there's just the fact that we have a less green parliament and a less green council going into this. So the commission has a less supportive political base to make these big moves in environmental and climate change policymaking. So we can't really deny the fact that the Greens lost seats in the parliament and the member states are going towards the right. That's just the reality of the situation. Geopolitics, as I mentioned, has also changed, right? So we need to make sure that even though defense is so important, especially given the belligerent comments coming from the United States, it is very worrying for everyone. We have to learn to multitask because the climate crisis is also just as urgent. And if we don't continue to maintain focus here and take radical action, we're going to be in big trouble sooner than we think. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all our speakers. Now, I'm not too familiar with Teams, but I'm sure like that if there is a function to upload, well, I'm using it and I'm sure that all our guests are using it. So we have a couple of questions already that have been inputted into the Q&A function. I do call on everyone who wants to ask questions to please put it into the function, and I'm going to try to address as many as possible. But I will then start with the first one, which I think is directed to Joël. And the question says, what impact has the annual rule of law report had on member states?
That's a very good question. And I'm not just saying that to avoid it, but the answer is it depends on what you mean by impact. If you're trying to ask whether or not this is substantially or even substantively in any way defined, stopped, prevented, or otherwise ameliorated the situation of the rule of law in the most offending states, no, it's done little or nothing. One of the issues of the rule of law report is it depends on your own commitment to doing well. It depends on your own commitment to getting a good grade. There are no consequences right now for doing badly. There's also a lot of problems with the methodology. I kind of highlighted some of them. The recommendations are incredibly broad. The language of the report is quite esoteric. It's very difficult for ordinary citizens, society organizations to understand what's being talked about. It's also a single report on a web page. There's no platform. It's not really accessible. It's not really transparent. We don't know how they're making decisions. There are a lot of problems with the report. That said, if we talk about impact, I am a keen advocate for the importance of having the report. It is promoting bilateral relations between the Commission and member state governments, member state civil servants, civil society organizations, judicial associations. It's very much promoting connection, discussion, evidence between the European Union, member states, and also with each other. Everyone reads each other's reports. It's a very good thing to have. So if we talk about, is this going to fix everything? No, not even slightly. Is this part of a wider conversation, a wider discussion or way of improving rule of law awareness, rule of law across the EU? Yes, it's part of that conversation, and it's an important part of that conversation. So impact depends on how you understand it.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joelle. So there are two questions for Elena next. First one from Evans Fanoulis, who is also a board member of the Irish Association for Contemporary European Studies. First, is the Commissioner for Defence and Space only nominally for space? Is there technocratic and political will to further develop the overlaps and interconnections between defence and space policy? And the second, to what extent the creation of the European Defence Union is legally and institutionally compatible with a scenario of creating some sort of a European army in the long run? Very unlikely, but still a contingency.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Evans, for these two important questions. On the first one, I have to say that I'm doing research only on defense. So my interviews are all on defense. But the impression I have when I was reading also documents by Kubilius, like his answer to the questionnaire by the European Parliament, if you give a look at it, you can see that the largest part of it, almost all of it, is on defense. So I would say that it's clear that space has to be on the political agenda of the Commission. So it's important that the commissioner has this competence, but I would say that defense is the priority in the short term. Space, I would say, a bit more in the long term. And then also, if I think in terms of the competencies, of the expertise of Kubilius, as I was saying before, he was the rapporteur of the European Parliament on Russia. So his expertise is on Russia, on Ukraine, on this type of foreign policy issues. So you might be right in saying that, in suggesting that it might be more nominally. I think that the idea is to have space has to be on the EU political agenda. We have to start working on it, even though it's clear that the priority is defense. This is what I would say. Second question, to what extent is the creation of the European Defence Union legally and institution compatible with the scenario of creating some sort of European army in the long run? As you say, it's very unlikely. I also think that this scenario of creating some sort of European army is very unlikely. I would say it's not likely at all. We are far away from this, so it's clear also in the documents by von der Leyen, so the political priorities, but also the mission letter to Cobilius. What she's always repeating is that member states are responsible for their armed forces. So there is no intention to create a European army. I would say also in the long run, what the Commission can only do, and this is the reason I was talking of growing differentiated integration, is to strengthen the military and civilian capabilities of the member states, but this is the direction which is not that of a European army, and this is also a problem because some were criticizing the recent proposal done by von der Leyen at the Munich Security Council to not to respect the rules of the Stability Pact on defense, because this means this gives the possibility to the member states individually to spend more, but not together. So it would be better to spend together, but we don't even manage to find at least yet they have not yet founded the resources to spend more together. So the Commission is proposing this to give them the possibility to spend more on defense, but individually. So I think we are really going in a different direction, which is, if you want, a sort of you could expect from an incremental point of view. So we have a sort of incremental change, but in a way that has already started, but we don't have the type of paradigmatic change that would be associated, I would say, with some sort of European army. Also, the joint projects, the common projects on important issues like the air shield. This is something that will be done together with the member states. So again, it's another, and probably those member states that will want to participate. So we are again in the area of differentiated integration. The same in terms for support on Ukraine. But this has to do with external security. So this is another issue. But this is the direction where we are going. This is what I would say. I hope I have addressed these two very important questions.
Thank you, Elena. Well, we'll come back on especially this concept of differentiated integration, because I saw other questions coming in. But since we were actually talking about army and war, I would actually abuse my role as a chair, asking Professor Hussein Kassim if he could comment on, well, do you think, have you seen in your research, in your discussions in Brussels with officials in the commissions, any debate around peace building? And I know it comes really from someone who has studied always the European Union and peace building and its role in peace processes. And as naive it could sound to speak about peace building in contemporary times, but I'm always the only one in the room that always says, well, stop for a minute. This was supposed to be the greatest peace process on earth, saying it with the words of John Hume. Is there any place for peace in the future of the European Commission agenda, do you think?
Yes, sadly, I don't think so. Defense and security are the sort of the sort of watchwords, economic security also, but peace building, no. And I think there was a lot of sort of despair in the organisation about the failure of the EU to get its act together with respect to Gaza, but also elsewhere. So sadly not.
Thank you. Now, there is a question for Jeffrey. The last time the US public administration withdrew from the Paris Agreement, EU together in the context of global climate governance. Is this something to be expected at this time?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that the EU-China relationship on climate policy is very complicated because on the one hand, both recognize the need to decarbonize their economy and both recognize the economic benefits that can be reaped from taking early action on developing green technologies, on developing net zero industries and things like that. So on the one hand, I think that in international climate politics, so at the UNFCCC negotiations, there can be a lot of productive working relationships between the EU and China on leading by example, on building coalitions between the other countries, on trying to bring others on board with getting their economies decarbonized. So yes, I do think that there can be very productive working relationships at the international level, especially as the US has once again decided to leave the Paris Agreement and left a bit of a leadership vacuum there. So I think that both can and both should step up to the plate and encourage others to embark on rapid decarbonization. However, there's always going to be friction because both blocks are competing in the net zero technological development race. So China and the EU are both trying to reap those benefits to protect the competitiveness of their own industries as they work on green technologies. So there's going to be some natural competition between the two that are unavoided. And if you look at this clean industrial deal that is on the agenda for next week, a big rationale of the clean industrial deal is to make sure that the EU's industries have a level playing field with those from China and the USA, right? So that's really written right into the text. So there's this natural element of competition as well. So I think there will always be a little bit of friction, a little bit of tension, but there is opportunities to work together in climate diplomacy and showing leadership for third-party countries, absolutely. So I think that there is possibility and that it should certainly happen. Fingers crossed. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. So the next one is for Dr. Joel Grogan. The speaker says, I agree with your statement that there needs to be trust in institutions to ensure the rule of law is upheld, as it is an essential pillar of society which one only notices once it's gone. With that in mind, what could the dismantling of extreme budget cuts of US federal institutions under DOGE, such as the Department of Defense, the Department of Education, FBI, CIA, mean for the rule of law and general welfare of the US population? Were such negative effects felt in Argentinian society under Milei?
So I'm going to begin with a disclaimer. Despite some assumptions on the strangeness of my accent, I'm not American. Also, despite the amount of American media I'm currently consuming, I'm not an American expert. So I cannot speak with any degree of expertise on the American context. However, I am a rule of law expert, and I can talk about what happens to institutions when they no longer exist, and also when they are severely undermined, especially if those institutions go to the accountability of government. We need to distinguish in this context between a dysfunctional institution, as in it's just not functioning correctly. And this is something that people are ordinarily frustrated with. You know, it'll take 10 years before you get your court case heard, is dysfunctional. Then you have malfunctioning. I'm kind of misusing that, but mal meaning malfides, as in institutions that are being used for political purposes. So taking control of justice departments, taking control of public prosecutors to use them against your political enemies, to use them to undermine any degree of opposition. Then you also have entirely dismantled or no institutions, getting rid of institutions that act as a check on power. So getting rid of election oversight institutions. That's one of the most it's deeply concerning. Malfunctional, dysfunctional, non-functional are all deeply, deeply, deeply concerning. Because one of the realities, and I know someone else, I know that other people on this panel will echo on this, which is once you lose institutions, once you lose the people, the culture, the environment, the institutional knowledge and expertise of institutions, it is incredibly, incredibly difficult to rebuild them. It takes years, if not decades. So when I look at states which are systematically dismantling, destroying, or otherwise getting rid of institutions or malfunctional, as in functioning for bad ends, it is deeply concerning because even if those institutions, we have a future election, we have a different administration, and the administration says we're going to rebuild the rule of law, a la Poland, the institutions are so fundamentally changed that it's not a situation of just going back to the way things were. It's building from zero again and building in a situation of extreme polarization, often extreme economic deficiency and economic crisis. It's so difficult. And that's a best case scenario. So I'm not a US expert. I can't speak on the US context, but as a rule of law expert, I find it deeply distressing any intimation that institutions themselves will be destroyed, controlled, or dismantled.
Thank you so much. I would actually ask the next question to the panel. If anyone wants to come in about differentiated integration, and how do you think differentiated integration will play out on defense policy? If you agree that it will, but if you don't, what are your thoughts on it? Anyone who wants to make a comment about this? Okay. Okay, Elena.
I can start, Giada. So, allora, what I expect when I think to differentiated integration on defense is that the member states will move individually. But at the same time, they will participate in joint project with other member states, each of them with different groups of member states for different projects, something similar to what happens for PESCO, Permanent Structural Cooperation, and at the same time there will be something at EU level, so the Commission will try to support with its budget or other tools that the Commission is trying to design how to provide them with more resources that they will have to use, in some cases jointly, but in other cases also individually. So I think that this will become something very complex, similar to differentiated integration, and from the point of view of EU citizens, something that is very difficult to understand who is responsible, who has to be accountable for the decisions that are taken. This is my view.
Thank you so much. Anyone else as a taker? If not, I'm going to move to the next question. Okay, well, there is a question that is open to the panel as well. So I'm going to ask this one. One second. Okay, given the shifting geopolitical landscape, does a potential increase the EU-China cooperation on clean tech offer a stabilizing factor, or does it risk entangling the EU in strategic tensions? Jeffrey, I would say this is your area. I don't like to pick people.
It's a tough one because I'm not a foreign policy guy. That's a hard question.
Hussein, do you have an opinion on this?
I mean, I don't really. Although I think that that we're in such a sort of strange place at the moment that when China comes out and says things like, Gaza's integrity has to be preserved, that suggests there's more scope for I don't know, partnership or cooperation at least than we previously thought.
Certainly. And well, I'm going to next call back on Elena, and because there is another question for her, and it is, do you believe that given the extremist influences affecting Europe and the current state of instability, it would be beneficial to establish a European federation to stabilize the continent and make it both economically and military independent?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. Yes, it's my personal belief, my personal thought, but I think that it would be absolutely beneficial to establish a European federation to stabilize the continent and make it both economically and military independent. Even though I don't believe it's something that it is likely. It is very likely to occur. As we know, there is no more debate on establishing a European federation. This is something that has been relaunched by a recent book by Sergio Fabbrini, but the idea of a federation is not for all the member states, but for a leading a core group of member states that are willing to make this step towards a federation. This is a scenario maybe more likely involving a small group of member states rather than all of them. All of them, it's clearly unlikely, but a small group, it could be more likely, even though I have many reservations on this as well. But it's true that there are extreme influences. There are these are very hard times, and so this is something that would be important for you citizens, but I'm not sure whether our leaders will be willing to delegate their sovereignty and move towards this decision, this type of decision. Obviously, my idea is that when you have even more differentiated integration, then the result is disintegration. So this would be an address to change the path that the European Union is taking, not the present, but I would say from decades, and reverse it. But I'm not sure that the member states are ready. There's not debate on this also among citizens. So I would say that we are far away, but I believe that it would be absolutely beneficial. And thank you for this question.
Thank you so much, Elena. So I have two questions for Jeffrey that I'm going to address all in once. The first one, I would like to ask Mr. Jeffrey what he thinks about the imports of materials and equipment for combating global warming in Europe, which Europe imports from China. Do you think it should be a top priority for Europe to become independent in this industrial sector? And the second one is wondering about the EU scripts where the Green Deal is a part of.
All right, so the first question is, I think that the EU certainly recognizes that it should become more self-sufficient and that there is an opportunity here for its industries to really begin cranking out these net zero technologies and these sorts of things. So I think that yes, the EU should be taking advantage of this opportunity and of this moment to increase competitiveness in this sector. And that it's starting to do so, right? So we had the Net Zero Industry Act come out during the von der Leyen One Commission, and it's sort of getting the ball rolling now, right? With trying to attract investments in net zero technologies and trying to simplify the environment to ensure that these businesses can get set up. Also, this Clean Industrial Deal is going to start paving the way for this as well, right? With companies being able to more easily draw state aid in for decarbonization projects. So I think that the EU recognizes that it should do more to be self-sufficient in green technologies and net zero technologies, and the ball is rolling in that court. So we're going to start to see it move a lot faster, and it really is a priority. I would say that actually is a priority, even of the von der Leyen II Commission, is to make this industrial base much more competitive. So they're on the way to sort of getting a level up from China and trying to take action in that field. So yes, I think it is a good thing, and I think that this commission also believes it is a good thing and is going to do so. About the EU scripts, where the Green Deal is a part of. EU scripts. I need a bit of clarification on that, but maybe.
Maybe the person can just input in the chat a clarification about it. And in the meantime, well, I would again abuse my role as chair and ask, well, both Professor Hussein Kassim and Joel, if, well, we haven't heard about the big elephant in the room for someone, especially who is based in Cardiff in the UK. And what or where do you see what's the state of affairs of UK-EU relations in the future? If there is any area in particular where there should be rapprochement, or if it is going to continue as it is, and I'm not saying it in a positive way.
Do you want me to speak to that? Yeah, I mean, again, sadly, there's no. You asked the question should. That's very different from where are we? And I mean, one of the things I've got used to from talking about UK-EU relations the last 9 years is that there's a lot of we've got a lot of identification of common interests and mutual interests, and therefore it follows that. But of course, that rules out, effectively screens out politics. And as we know, politics is huge here. It is a real issue. So my work for UK and Changing Europe is to actually monitor the EU side, and so I often go to speak to people in the EU institutions and speak to people in the member states, particularly people who are in the Council Working Group. And I think that, quite honestly, the reset is very profoundly stalled, with one possible exception. But even here, there is an issue, and that is a common pact on foreign and on security and defence policy. So there is a summit planned. It's in the diary, but it's unclear what the sort of shape of that is. The hesitation is not really on the EU side, although there's still a sort of case of, on the EU side, it's very much a case of the UK being a demandeur, what exactly does it want? It's asked for a reset. It's asked for this cooperation in this particular area, but it isn't really specifying exactly what it wants. That's the cause of some sort of frustration and hesitation. We also did a report for UK and Changing Europe 2 weeks after the government had been elected, or the new government had been elected in the UK, and there'd been that sort of flurry of activity. So it looked like that the new government was going to sort of make good on its promise of reset. There was the sort of the visit to the 4 capitals that the Labour Party had identified as being the sort of key ones. Dublin, Warsaw, Berlin, and Paris. There'd also been high-level meetings with the Commission, and then there was just a long kind of silence. And what we said in that report essentially was, this isn't only a question of what you decide would be in the sort of mutual interests of the UK and the EU, but especially a benefit to the UK. You've also got to explain where we are to the British public. You've got to say, what the TCA involved, what the withdrawal agreement involved, and you've got to make the argument for something better, different, for advantage. Because inevitably, if you start talking about our rapprochement, what you will get you'll get the Eurosceptic press, but you'll also get David Frost, you'll get Boris Johnson saying, this is a betrayal of the vote in 2016, all of that kind of thing. So you've got to be ready to address those arguments. And what we see so far is the UK not really doing any of that. The government, not doing any of that. It is, of course, concerned about. The Labour Party is concerned about losing votes to the Reform Party. The sort of polling shows that 80% of the seats it won in the last election are at risk. One can understand that. One can also understand that the election probably came 6 months earlier than the Labour Party had anticipated. But the politics of this are not necessarily going to get any better or any easier. And that's that is quite worrying, because you can argue that membership, it was argued, wasn't very effective, that Brexit wasn't very effective, that the reset wasn't very effective. So why should we bother with Europe? That's the kind of concern that that we might have about this. So I'm afraid I can't be very optimistic about this, but I can point to a UK and Changing Europe report, or Living with the Neighbours report from July, which sort of tries to tease out exactly what some of the areas where the UK was saying, oh, we must do this SPS, this kind of thing, but actually what the challenges were, not only technical but also political. So it's a long answer, but that's where I am on this.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And since we only have 3 minutes left, I would ask, I'll ask question to Elena that has come up in the chat, where this speaker asked, so which member states have showed more inclination towards building a European federation with less states? Do you believe this might be up for discussion currently due to the current US support for Putin and a weak peace? A very small question to close.
Thank you for this question. I would say that this issue is not on the agenda of the European Union. So the member states, all of them, they have not shown, I don't see any inclination by the member states towards joining a European Federation. So I would say that not only from their perspective, so the perspective of the member states, but also from the perspective of the institution, it is not on the agenda. This is something that should probably be promoted by EU citizens. And I agree with you that the current context, so what is happening with the US support for Putin and this weak peace, this capitulation of Ukraine, and probably EU as well, might represent the proper context. But I don't see member states and institutions mobilizing for this. So it would be probably something that citizens should do. Thank you very much for this question.
Well, I thank you so much, everyone, for your really insightful questions. And I would ask everyone to join me with a big, huge round of applause for our speakers. This has been extremely interesting, and I just hope we can meet again in maybe another 6 months and keep on reflecting on this constantly moving and constantly changing, really, really important matter. So, grazie mille. Thank you very much for your time. And up until next time, I wish you, everyone, a very nice weekend and a very nice continuation of your academic year. Grazie mille, veramente.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Arrivederci.